Atlanta drivers cruise through downtown, but beneath the streets, another world helps tell the story of the South's busiest city.
This is where Atlanta began in a lot of senses because Atlanta was built as a railroad junction town, built up around that junction. It quickly grew into a lot more than just a railroad town, but the place where the tracks came together is really the reason why Atlanta exists.
Jeff Morrison has been helping people understand Atlanta's past for more than a decade.
For over 12 years, I've been leading people on walking tours through this area that I call the Unseen Underground Walking Tour. And I do it because I enjoy making people aware of what's down here.
And this is where the history begins, with an unassuming railroad mile marker.
The 0 mile post represents the physical endpoint of the Western and Atlantic Railroad and the point of junction with the Georgia Railroad and the Macon and Western, the first 3 railroads that form the junction here in Atlanta.
After considering another location nearby, railroad surveyors ultimately put the 0 mile post here in the mid-1800s. That set the foundation for a city that would become known as Atlanta.
This definitely was where Atlanta was founded and grew up around. There wasn't really any significant settlement here prior to the railroads, so it was businesses that came because of the railroad junction. They grew up right around this spot.
Today, the original 0 mile post that dates back to 1850 is housed about 10 miles away at the Atlanta History Center. There's no doubt the men who placed that marker would no longer recognize the structures that have gone up around it. By the late 1800s, trains dominated everyday life, and they were starting to get in the way.
It was noisy, dirty, dangerous area, and even now we can understand that having a giant railroad junction in the middle of your downtown is problematic.
The engineers of the day decided Atlanta needed to rise above the railroad, so they began to build viaducts to carry traffic over the tracks.
As they built more and more of these viaducts and interconnected them, and then the buildings were built right up against the viaducts, and their front doors became the entrances at the street level. It got to be that you couldn't really tell when you were on the elevated streets and when you were at the ground level.
What was originally ground level now makes up Atlanta's so-called unseen underground.
One thing that you see through a lot of these areas is how Atlanta has been building itself up in layers over and over and kind of reinventing itself on top, and there's still little remnants of its past underneath.
Remnants like these old bumpers that prevented rail cars from damaging the pillars of the viaduct above.
It's interesting to find these little remnants, and when you understand what they are, they start to tell the story of what was happening down here way back then.
It's hard to imagine, but over the years, the city has had multiple passenger stations, with 2 of those being built in the 20th century. Terminal Station started operations in 1905, and the smaller Union Station, seen here in this colorful historic postcard, opened in 1930. Both were torn down in the early 1970s. And even though Atlanta no longer has a downtown passenger terminal, freight trains are still navigating this urban underworld. But the history isn't all hidden underground. You can still find some railroad remnants in an area known as the Gulch.
The area of these parking lots around the stadiums that's being referred to now as the Gulch was all of the railroad yards that served Union Station and Terminal Station. There's even lines, cracks in the asphalt of the parking lot that replicate the curvature of a lot of the old railroad sidings.
Most of the tracks are now gone, and you'll see more cars than trains down here.
It is an area that still gets occupied a lot, whether it's parking for the local office buildings or tailgating on game days.
But many people want to see the Gulch used for more than just parking.
The city is engaged in a development deal to build more elevated streets and fill in a lot of the area with commercial and housing and retail development. So there's still a lot of speculation about this potentially looking quite a bit different in the next few years.
Those changes mean history is disappearing. This interlocking tower stood for more than 100 years, but was demolished by Norfolk Southern as construction began in and around this old Southern Railway office building. This bridge came down several months later. Some might say that's just the way Atlanta is.
It's always placed more value on development and building for the future. Usually our history is abandoned or set aside or built on top of at the expense of that.
But with a little education and public involvement, we might be able to salvage the landmarks that made our cities into what they are today.
It is important to understand our history and preserve it so that we have an awareness of it, because that's how we have an understanding of who we are and an appreciation for those who have come before us. If we really want to build for the future and continue to grow in a smart way, we need to understand how we got here and why.